Hello, YNABers. My name is Jesse Meekum, and this is podcast number 335 for YNAB, where we teach you 4 rules to help you stop living paycheck to paycheck, get out of debt, and save more money. A while back, years ago, I recall I don't know where I was, in a meeting of some kind, and I just had the thought, it might have been around just, last week we talked about kind of my thoughts on what parents need to provide their kids, and that relates to budgeting in such a strong way, because kids can be viewed as terribly expensive, and it just doesn't have to be that way. Anyway, so I had a thought a while ago. Julie and I made an agreement a long time ago. Before we even got married, we knew we wanted Julie to be able to stay home and raise the kids and run the house and do what she had wanted to do since she was teeny tiny. And I knew that I wanted to provide. And so we very cleanly split those roles up. And I've always been, we've been married 15 years, and I've always been the provider, and Julie has been the glue, the oil, the crux, the linchpin, the foundation of the household and the kids. And she's been able to do it full time. It's been a huge blessing for us, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And it was one of my non-negotiables that forced me to start YNAB. So you can think about this not from a dad and his sense of obligation, but just how you've divvied up responsibilities. You may very well feel this obligation as a couple together. And Julie does feel this. It's not in the way that it's like, oh, go out and get a paycheck kind of way, but it's still very much the same. And that is, we are, if we go back to my prior podcast, we were talking about providing food, clothing, and shelter. And that obligation, it's not about making a car payment. It's not about, your obligations as we talk about them at YNAB around debt and things like, oh, I've got these obligations. Like, those are core obligations. You are obligated to provide a place for your kids to sleep where they are safe, and as safe as you can possibly manage, and where they have food and clothing. And it doesn't have to be nice clothing, fancy clothing, but clothing. And it doesn't have to be the fanciest of food or the healthiest of food, but they need to make, you need to make sure you're feeding them. Everyone knows that. You shouldn't even have to discuss it, right? And I probably should just skip over all that and everyone would just nod. Yeah, of course. Get on with your point. So when you have a shock to your personal financial situation, and let's call it a job loss, because this was the one that I thought about. I wasn't thinking about job loss back in the day. I was thinking about, it was about 10 years ago, I was thinking about YNAB failing. If YNAB just crashed and burned and I didn't have an income for a length of time, what would that be like? And I was walking in my mind pretty clearly back through and kind of what would things be like. And that was the point where I decided I wanted to not just save up some money, but also set aside, fill up our pantry. And the reason was, I think I remembered that Katrina had happened. I don't remember the year. Was it 2005? Kind of ashamed that I don't remember the year of that. 2006 maybe? I'd have to look it up. But that was still fresh in my mind. And we live in a place that's, as far as natural disasters go, fairly safe, I guess. But I just thought, what if, for a little while, we couldn't just pop over to the store and grab something? Does my obligation to provide food to my family end when the supply chain's interrupted? And I am not talking about the zombie apocalypse. We all know that's going to be at least 40 years away. I'm just talking about something that's power outage for a little while. There are parts of the country, more rural parts or parts that experience extreme weather, where they handle this a lot better. I feel like where we are, we're skating on this ice that, maybe it's secure, but I didn't do an analysis. This is the crux of it, and then I'll stop because I don't want to. I feel like I'll be talking in circles. This is the crux of it. I don't have probabilities around if an earthquake would ever disrupt, our state's supply chain, or if a tornado would ever come along and wreak havoc, and it would be weeks before we could get things back in hand. Or if YNAB failed and I couldn't, we ran out of money. We have a cash emergency fund, but what if it was a really long time? What if there was a massive depression, where like back in the 20s and 30s, well, mainly 30s, we had 25% unemployment across the board, and those that were employed were underemployed a lot of the time. What if? I don't have probabilities on those, neither do you. But my only truth was, if something like that happens, does my obligation to provide food, clothing, and shelter to my kids cease? And it doesn't. And that was what made me decide to fill up our pantry. So I just started buying more food than we needed to eat on a regular basis, and I've done it ever since. We just rotate through. And it's because I don't see my obligation going away just because our circumstances go terribly south. It's still there, and I still wanted to be able to handle it. So it's kind of like that story where, was it an ant that stores up for the winter or something, and you just are kind of always setting things aside while you make hay while the sun shines. And that's kind of the approach I've taken. Nothing crazy. The zombie bunker's not even finished yet because I do have 40 years. But just more of the normal things. There's no way of knowing when they'll happen, but if they do happen, I want to be able to say that I was still able to meet my obligation to provide for my family. So that has very little to do with budgeting specifically. I will say it's not as hard as it sounds to start buying a little extra and storing it. And I'll also say that this is all just on my mind because of that book that I read, that Anti-Fragile book. And I've just been thinking a lot about if there's a shock to my personal situation or more of a macro shock, could we actually benefit from it, or at least not be totally fragile? So that's one other thought, is instead of all your cash in an emergency fund, maybe you have some extra food set aside, and so you could last a few extra days or a week or two, and not be totally stressing, because the situation will be stressful enough as is. Until next time, follow YNAB's 4 rules and you will win financially. You've never budgeted like this.